The Soviet ALFA-class submarine, intelligence failure, technology shock, and the collapse of naval assumptions. Segment 1. The birth of a naval phantom. The Cold War was not merely a conflict of armies, ideologies, or economies. Beneath the oceans, hidden from public view, another war unfolded. Silent, mathematical, and merciless. This underwater struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union became one of the most technologically demanding confrontations in modern history. In this world, detection meant survival, silence meant power, and a few seconds of speed could determine whether a submarine lived or vanished forever into the abyss. Within this hidden battlefield emerged one of the most terrifying naval projects ever attempted by the Soviet Union, the Alpha-class submarine. To Western analysts, the submarine initially appeared impossible. It violated too many assumptions simultaneously. It was too fast, too deep diving, too automated, too technologically ambitious for what the United States believed Soviet engineering culture was capable of achieving. That disbelief came that disbelief became the first stage of failure. The Alpha-class submarine didn't simply challenge NATO naval systems, it challenged Western psychology itself. For decades, American intelligence institutions had developed a fixed mental image of Soviet military development. The Soviet systems were generally viewed as rugged, practical, and heavily armed, but technologically conservative. The Western analysts believed the Soviet Union preferred gradual improvements over radical experimentation. In their minds, Soviet military doctrine emphasized quantity and reliability rather than sophisticated high-risk engineering. That assumption became a strategic trap, because while the United States optimized for consistency and operational safety, segments of the Soviet military-industrial complex pursued something entirely different: breakthrough asymmetry. The Soviets understood that matching the United States ship for ship would be economically exhausting. Instead, they sought selective technological dominance, areas where one disruptive capability could stabilize an entire enemy doctrine. The Alpha class became one of these weapons. Its development began during a period when submarine warfare was rapidly evolving into an arms race beneath the oceans. Nuclear submarines had already transformed naval power by eliminating the limitations of diesel-electric vessels. Submarines could now remain submerged for months, travel across entire oceans without surfacing, carry nuclear weapons capable of destroying cities. But this technological revolution also created a new strategic obsession: one who could detect the enemies before the enemies detected themselves. Detection was everything. A submarine that could remain hidden while identifying enemy vessels held overwhelming advantage. Every improvement in solar technology triggered counter improvements in stealth, hull design, speed, reactor system, and acoustic suppression. The underwater battlefield became a constant competition between hunters and ghosts. The Soviets realized something dangerous. The United States had begun relying too heavily on stable assumptions. NATO anti-submarine warfare doctrine was designed around the expected submarine behavior, expected depth range, expected speed ranges, expected acoustic signatures. American systems worked exceptionally well against known patterns, but systems built around patterns become fragile when confronted by anomalies. The Alpha class project was designed to become that anomaly. Unlike traditional Soviet submarines, the Alpha was conceived not as a balanced vessel but as an extreme machine optimized around a few overwhelming advantages. The submarine would prioritize speed, depth, and technological disruption over cost efficiency or operational simplicity. This philosophy alone represented a dramatic break from conventional Soviet naval design logic. Its most revolutionary feature was its titanium hull. Titanium was extraordinarily difficult and expensive to work with. It required specialized welding environments and advanced metallurgy. The manufacturing precision was far beyond what most Western analysts believed Soviet industry possessed. Yet titanium offered extraordinary benefits. It was lighter than steel while maintaining exceptional strength. It resisted corrosion. Most importantly, it allowed the submarine to dive deeper while reducing magnetic detectability. This single design decision would eventually terrify NATO naval planners. At the beginning, the evidence appeared fragmented. Reconnaissance photographs showed unusual reflections on Soviet submarine hulls. Intelligence analysts observed strange industrial procurement patterns connected to titanium processing facilities. Shipyards in Leningrad and Severodvinsk, Severodvinsk displayed actively displayed activity inconsistent with ordinary submarine construction, yet these signals were treated individually rather than collectively. That was the fatal analytical mistake. Instead of seeing a coordinated technological revolution, Western intelligence agencies initially processed each anomaly as an isolated irregularity. Analysts debated whether the reflective hull sections were aluminum paint, experimental coatings, or deliberate deception. Some dismissed the evidence entirely because it contradicted accepted assumptions about Soviet industrial capacity. This reveals the deepest weakness of large intelligence systems. They often resist conclusion that would force institutional adaptation. The problem was not lack of information, the problem was psychological inertia. As evidence accumulated throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, a growing number of analysts began realizing that something unprecedented might be under construction. Reports suggested a submarine smaller than existing Soviet attack submarines but possessing extreme speed potential. Some intelligence fragments implied unusually high automation levels and reduced crew requirements. Others hinted at experimental reactor technologies far more dangerous than standard nuclear propulsion systems. Skepticism dominated. The United States naval leadership structure had been shaped heavily by doctrines emphasizing reactor safety, redundancy, and long term reliability. The idea that the Soviets would deploy a compact submarine using a liquid metal cooled reactor and extensive automation appears reckless, even irrational, from the American perspective. But the Soviets were operating under a different logic altogether. They were willing to accept engineering instability in exchange for temporary technological superiority. That difference in strategic culture would become one of the most important lessons of the Alpha story. By the early 1970s, the submarine that NATO would designate as the Alpha-class was no longer theoretical. It was becoming operational reality. Yet many within the Western intelligence community still resisted the implications. Accepting the truth would require acknowledging that Soviet naval engineering had achieved breakthroughs Western analysts considered improbable or impossible, and that realization carried dangerous consequences. Because if the Soviets could build a submarine capable of outrunning NATO torpedoes, diving below effective engagement depth, and operating with dramatically reduced acoustic signature, then existing anti-submarine warfare doctrine might already be obsolete. The Alpha was no longer merely a submarine, it was a warning. Segment 2: Titanium, liquid metal, and the engineering logic of extreme risk. The Alpha class submarine didn't emerge from ordinary engineering philosophy. It was built around a principle that most military systems avoid because the risks are too severe. Concentrate multiple revolutionary technologies into a single operational platform and accept instability as a cost of breakthrough capability. Most states do not build weapons this way. Traditional military procurement systems prefer gradual evolution. Small improvements reduce uncertainty, control costs, and maintain operational reliability. Incremental development minimizes catastrophic failure. It protects bureaucracy from embarrassment and preserves institutional confidence. The Alpha program rejected that logic almost entirely. The Soviets were willing to gamble. This is the first point Western analysts consistently failed to understand. Soviet military planners were not trying to create the safest submarine, they were trying to create a submarine capable of temporarily breaking the entire strategic balance beneath the oceans. That distinction changes everything. At the heart of the Alpha project was the decision to construct the submarine using a titanium pressure hull. In engineering terms, this choice bordered on insanity. Titanium was one of the most difficult industrial metals available during the Cold War era. Unlike steel, titanium required highly specialized production methods. Even minor contamination during welding could weaken structural integrity. Large scale titanium fabrication demanded controlled environments, advanced metallurgy expertise, and industrial precision rarely attempted at such scale anywhere in the world. American analysts considered widespread Soviet titanium submarine construction improbable precisely because of these difficulties. From the US perspective, the economic and technical costs appeared irrational. The assumption was simple: no state would willingly absorb such industrial inefficiency for uncertain gains. But that assumption revealed something deeper about the American strategic thinking. The United States tended to evaluate military systems through the lens of optimization, balance capability, reliability, cost, logistics, and sustainability. The Soviet Union, at least in this project, prioritized asymmetric strategic effect over optimization efficiency. Titanium offered several extraordinary advantages that justified the gamble. First, titanium possessed an exceptional strength to weight ratio. Compared to conventional steel hulls, a titanium submarine could achieve greater structural strength while remaining significantly lighter. This reduction in weight translated directly into performance advantages. Second, titanium resisted corrosion far better than steel. In long-term underwater operations, corrosion resistance dramatically improves survivability and maintenance performance. Third, and perhaps the most terrifying part, was titanium possessed low magnetic properties. Magnetic anomaly detection systems relied on identifying disturbance in Earth's magnetic field caused by large metallic objects. A titanium hull reduced this detectability, making the submarine more difficult to track using existing anti-submarine detection methods. But the greatest advantage was depth. Depth in submarine warfare is power. A deeper diving submarine gains multiple strategic benefits simultaneously: increased survivability, reduced detection probability, greater maneuvering freedom, ability to evade existing torpedoes. If a submarine can dive deeper than enemy weapons can effectively operate, then detection alone becomes meaningless. You may know where the enemy is, but you cannot destroy it. The Alpha's titanium hull pushed directly towards this objective. Reports and later assessments suggested that the submarine could operate at depths significantly exceeding many contemporary Western submarines. This instantly threatened NATO anti-submarine warfare doctrine because existing engagement assumptions were built around known operational depth ranges. The Alpha was designed to exist outside those assumptions, yet titanium alone wasn't enough. Speed became the second pillar of the Alpha concept. To achieve extraordinary underwater velocity, Soviet engineers pursued another radical gamble: the liquid metal cooled nuclear reactor. Most nuclear submarines of the era relied pressured pressurized water reactors. These systems were comparatively stable and well understood. They prioritized operational safety and long-term reliability. American naval doctrine, heavily influenced by Admiral Hyman Rickover, emphasized reactor discipline, redundancy, and procedural control. The philosophy was straightforward: nuclear accidents aboard submarines were strategically unaccepted. Nuclear accidents aboard submarines were strategically unacceptable. The Soviets chose a different path. The Alpha utilized a liquid metal coolant system, likely based on lead bismuth alloy. In theory, this reactor design offered enormous advantage. Liquid metal coolant could operate at higher temperatures and transfer heat more efficiently than conventional water-based systems. This allowed the reactor to produce tremendous power output relative to its size. More power meant more speed, and speed was the true obsession behind the Alpha project. Submarine warfare traditionally favored stealth over velocity. A submarine that moved too fast generated noise, cavitation, and acoustic signatures easier to detect, but the Soviets envisioned a different tactical doctrine. Instead of merely hiding, the Alpha would exploit extreme acceleration and velocity to overwhelm enemy tracking system and escape torpedo engagement zones. It was not merely a stealth submarine, it was an underwater interceptor. Soviets eventually suggested the Alpha could could exceed 40 knots underwater, an extraordinary figure for its era. This speed transformed tactical calculations completely. A submarine capable of such accelerations gained severe advantages: rapid repositioning during engagements, ability to outrun certain torpedoes, faster response to contact detections, greater operational unpredictability. But the reactor system came with severe dangers. Liquid metal reactors were notoriously unstable and maintenance intensive. If the coolant solidified, catastrophic engineering complications could occur. Reactors operations demanded extreme technical precision. failures could become fatal quickly. The United States largely avoided such systems because the operational risk outweighed the perceived advantage. Again, the Soviets accepted the risk. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the Alpha story. Western analysts interpreted danger as deterrence. The Soviets interpreted danger as acceptable cost. That difference in mentality created strategic surprise. The Alpha's engineering philosophy extended beyond hull design and propulsion. Soviet engineers aggressively pursued automation to reduce crew size. This decision shocked Western observers almost as much as titanium hull itself. Traditional nuclear submarines required large crews because submarine operations were extraordinarily complex. Navigation, reactor monitoring, sonar operations, weapon management, life support systems, and maintenance demanded constant human oversight. Western doctrine emphasized manpower redundancy because combat damage or system failure could rapidly become catastrophic underwater. The Alpha disrupted this assumption. Advanced automation systems reduced crew requirements dramatically. Some intelligence estimates suggested crews as low as 30 to 40 personnel, far below many comparable submarines. Smaller crews produce multiple advantages: reduced internal volume requirements, smaller submarine profile, lower life support demands, potentially lower acoustic signature. But automation introduced vulnerability. If automated systems fail during combat, recovery options could be limited. Once again, the Soviets prioritized capability gains over conservative safety margins. Western analysts struggled to process this because they evaluated Soviet decisions through American doctrinal logic. From the US perspective, these choices appeared recklessly unstable. But viewed through Soviet strategic priorities, the logic became clear. The Alpha was never designed to become the perfect submarine. It was designed to become the most disruptive submarine. That distinction explains everything. By the mid 1970s, the implications were becoming unavoidable. Reconnaissance, industrial intelligence, and operational observations became increasingly confirmed that the Soviet Union had indeed constructed an extraordinary underwater platform, one capable of challenging NATO assumptions about speed, depth, and survivability. And the depth realization slowly began to emerge inside America's naval circles. If the Soviets were willing to absorb massive engineering risk for selective technological breakthroughs, then the United States might no longer control the pace of underwater innovation. The Alpha was not merely advancing submarine technology, it was changing the rules of naval competition itself. Segment 3: Intelligence Failure and the Collapse of Western Assumptions. The most dangerous enemy is intelligence work. In intelligence work is not lack of information, it is attachment to old conclusions. The Alpha-class submarine exposed this weakness with brutal clarity. By the early 1970s, fragments of evidence pointing towards an advanced Soviet submarine program had already accumulated across multiple intelligence channels. Reconnaissance photographs revealed strange hull reflections, industrial surveillance indicated abnormal titanium procurement patterns, shipyard observations suggested compact but technologically sophisticated submarine constructions. Reports hinted at unusually small crews and experimental reactor systems. Yet, despite mounting indicators, large portions of the Western intelligence establishment resisted the implications. This resistance wasn't accidental, it emerged from the structure of intelligence systems themselves. Most intelligence organizations are built around pattern recognition. Analysts study historical behavior, identify recurring trends, and construct predictive models based on established doctrine. Under normal conditions, this approach works reasonably well because most states behave consistently over time. Military bureaucracies favor continuity. Procurement systems move slowly. Strategic cultures evolve gradually. But this creates a dangerous vulnerability. When a state deliberately breaks from its historical patterns, intelligence systems often misclassify the changes as error, anomaly, or deception rather than recognizing genuine transformation. That is exactly what happened with the Alpha submarine. For decades, American naval analysts viewed Soviet engineering philosophy through a specific lens. The Soviets were believed to prioritize ruggedness, simplicity, mass production, incremental development. This framework shaped how intelligence data was interpreted. Any evidence contradicting the model triggered skepticism rather than as a reassessment. The Alpha program violated too many assumptions simultaneously. A titanium pressure hull implied Industrial sophistication beyond expected Soviet capability. A liquid metal reactor implied tolerance for engineering instability inconsistent with American perceptions of Soviet naval doctrine. Extensive automation contradicted assumptions about Soviet technology limitations in advanced systems integration. The conclusion appeared too disruptive to accept easily. This is the hidden weakness of powerful institutions. They often protect existing frameworks because those frameworks justify existing systems, budgets, doctrines, and leadership assumptions. Admitting the reality of the Alpha submarine meant acknowledging severely uncomfortable truths. Soviet engineering capabilities had not been underestimated. Existing NATO anti submarine warfare doctrine might be partially obsolete. US technological superiority beneath the oceans was less secure than believed. Strategic adaptations would require expensive redesigns and doctrinal changes. These implications created institutional resistance. In many ways, intelligence systems behave like political systems. Information that threatens internal stability encounters friction. Analysts who challenge accepted assumptions frequently face skepticism, delay, or professional isolation. Consensus becomes self protective. The Alpha class demonstrates how dangerous this can become. One of the most significant figures during this period was intelligence analyst Herb Lord, who played a major role in synthesizing scattered evidence into a coherent assessment. His importance didn't stem from mystical brilliance but from persistence and methodological discipline. He aggregated weak signals others evaluated separately. This distinction matters enormously. Most intelligence failures do not occur because evidence is absent. They occur because evidence remains fragmented. Different departments hold different pieces of the puzzle, but no system successfully integrates them into a unified strategic picture. The Alpha submarine existed inside those fragments long before the full reality was accepted. Photographic analysts noticed unusual metallic reflections. Industrial analysts observed titanium related activity. Naval observers tracked abnormal shipyard operations. Technical experts debated propulsion anomalies. Individually, none of these observations appeared decisive. Collectively, they pointed towards a revolutionary submarine program. But institutional systems tend to compartmentalize information. This fragmented delayed recognition. As reports intensified, debate inside American naval circles became increasingly tense. Some analysts argue that the Soviets were merely experimenting with advanced technologies unlikely to become operationally successful. Others insisted that engineering challenges were too severe for reliable deployment. In effect, many experts interpreted technical difficulty as strategic impossibility. This became another catastrophic miscalculation. The Soviets were not pursuing optimization; they were pursuing disruption. From Moscow's perspective, even partial operational success could create enormous strategic value if it forced NATO to redesign weapon system and reconsider naval doctrine. The Alpha didn't need to dominate every engagement. It only needed to introduce uncertainty into the underwater balance of power. And uncertainty itself is a weapon. By this stage, Western analysts faced another problem: cognitive anchoring. Cognitive anchoring occurs when early assumptions continue shaping interpretation even after contradictory evidence emerges. Initial judgment about Soviet conservatism influenced how all future intelligence was evaluated. Instead of allowing new evidence to reshape the model, analysts unconsciously forced evidence back into the old framework. This psychological effect is extremely common in strategic failure. History repeatedly demonstrates that dominant powers often underestimate emerging threats because they interpret new developments using outdated assumptions. The British underestimated early German industrial militarization before World War One. France underestimated German maneuver warfare before 1940. The United States underestimated Japanese carrier aviation doctrine before Pearl Harbor. The Alpha submarine became another example of this pattern. The deeper issue was not technological miscalculation, it was intellectual rigidity. At the center of the controversy was the submarine's extraordinary reported speed. Intelligence estimates suggested underwater velocities exceeding 40 knots appeared almost absurd by existing standards. Such speeds threatened to invalidate existing NATO torpedo engagement assumptions. Traditional anti-submarine doctrine depended heavily on predictable submarine movement patterns. Torpedoes were designed around known performance envelopes. Sonar tracking relied on expected acoustic behaviors. The Alpha threatened to exceed these envelopes. If the submarine could accelerate rapidly and outrun engagement calculations, then NATO submarine might struggle to maintain tactical control during encounters. This realization triggered increasing concern inside naval intelligence communities. Another problem soon emerged. The Alpha was not simply fast, it was difficult to classify acoustically. Submarine warfare depended heavily on acoustic intelligence. Early class of submarine produced distinct sound signatures generated by machinery, propellers, coolant systems, and hull interactions with water. Detecting and identifying these signatures allows submarine to track adversaries without direct visual contact. The Alpha's unique design complicated this process further. Its compact hull, advanced reactor system, and high-speed operating characteristics created acoustic behaviors different from many previously observed Soviet submarines. This introduced uncertainty into NATO's sonar analysis system. Again, the problem was not merely technological, it was doctrinal. NATO anti-submarine warfare had evolved around known Soviet operational patterns. The Alpha represented a submarine designed specifically to escape those assumptions. As evidence accumulated, intelligence assessments slowly shifted from skepticism towards alarm. Reports increasingly concluded that the Soviets had indeed deployed a highly advanced submarine platform capable of challenging Western underwater dominance. But by then, years had already been lost. That delay mattered enormously because strategic competition is governed by time as much as technology. The state that recognizes disruption first gains adaptation advantage. The state that recognizes it late is forced into reactive defense. The United States eventually adopted many of its systems and doctrines, but the Alpha episode exposed a deeper vulnerability beneath American technological confidence. Even highly sophisticated intelligence systems can become prisoners of their own assumptions, and once institutions begin defending old conclusions instead of pursuing uncomfortable truths, strategic surprise becomes inevitable. The Alpha submarine was not simply a Soviet naval architecture. It was a proof that powerful systems often failed precisely because they believed themselves too advanced to be fundamentally wrong. Segment 4: Speed, Depth, and the Fear Inside NATO Naval Command. The true terror of the Alpha-class submarine didn't come from its appearance, it came from what it threatened to do to the mathematics of underwater warfare. Most people imagine naval conflict in simplistic terms: ships firing missiles, submarines launching torpedoes, fleets maneuvering across oceans. But beneath the surface, submarine warfare is fundamentally a different war of calculations. Detecting range, closing speed, engagement geometry, acoustic signatures, reaction time, operational depth. Victory underwater depends less on firepower, more on which side controls the engagement timeline. The Alpha threatened to seize that control away from NATO. Its reported underwater speed became the center of growing alarm within Western naval circles. Intelligence estimates increasingly suggested the submarine could exceed 40 knots submerged, far beyond the performance of many contemporary attack submarines. This mattered for reasons far more serious than prestige. Submarine combat depends heavily on prediction. Torpedoes are not magically self-thinking weapons. They rely on tracking calculations, target movement projections, and engagement envelopes. A submarine moving at extreme depth can distort those calculations dramatically. The faster a submarine moves, the harder it becomes to maintain sonar contact. The more difficult interception solutions become, the smaller the reaction window becomes for enemy vessels. The Alpha transformed speed into a strategic weapon. NATO commanders began realizing that many existing torpedo systems had already been designed around assumption tied to slower Soviet submarine behavior. Engagement geometries that worked against conventional targets could become unreliable against vessels capable of extraordinary acceleration and rapid directional shifts. This created a deeply uncomfortable possibility. The Soviet submarine capable of escaping engagement that NATO weapon systems were designed to win. That realization produced anxiety throughout naval planning communities. For decades, the United States Navy had enjoyed growing confidence in its anti-submarine warfare capabilities. American sonar networks, patrol aircraft, hunter-killer submarines, and torpedo systems represented one of the most sophisticated underwater warfare architectures in history. NATO doctrine increasingly assumed that Soviet submarine could eventually be detected, tracked, and neutralized through superior Western technology. The Alpha disrupted this confidence because suddenly the issue was no longer simply detection, it was pursuit. Even if NATO submarines had identified an Alpha, maintaining engagement control against such speed became far more difficult. Sonar tracking solutions degraded more rapidly during high speed maneuvers. Acoustic conditions underwater changed unpredictably at extreme velocity. Torpedo engagement windows narrowed. The speed was only half the problem. The Alpha's extraordinary diving capacity introduced a second nightmare. Depth underwater is comparable to altitude in aerial warfare. A fighter jet operating above an enemy aircraft gains enormous tactical flexibility. Similarly, submarines operating deeper than other opponents gain advantage in concealment, maneuverability, and survivability. The Alpha's titanium hull allowed operational depth significantly greater than many NATO submarines and torpedoes were optimized to counter. This created an operational asymmetry that deeply concerned NATO strategists. If the Alpha could descend below effective engagement zones during combat, then many existing NATO anti-submarine systems might lose kill capacity entirely. In effect, the submarine could use depth as a shield. Detection without destruction is strategically useless. This forced NATO planners into a dangerous assessment. Existing underwater warfare doctrine had assumed that once Soviet submarines were located, coordinated NATO assets could eventually constrain and destroy them. The Alpha challenged that assumption directly. Now, NATO faced a submarine potentially capable of outrunning certain torpedo solutions, escaping below effective engagement depth, complicating sonar tracking through rapid maneuvering, reducing magnetic detectability through titanium construction. This cumulative effect had psychological as much as tactical effect. Inside military system, confidence is an operational asset. Doctrine functions effectively only when commanders trust their system will perform within expected parameters. Once uncertainty enters the equation, strategic stability weakens. The Alpha introduced uncertainty everywhere. Reports from intelligence communities increasingly describe the submarine almost mythologically. Impossibly fast, technologically reckless, difficult to track, unpredictable in combat. This reputation amplified its strategic effect beyond raw numbers. In reality, the Alpha program faced many engineering difficulties and operational limitations. Maintenance complexity remained severe. Reactor systems demanded extraordinary care. High-speed operations increased acoustic signatures. The submarines were expensive and difficult to sustain. But strategic fear really depends on perfect reality. Fear depends on perceived capability combined with uncertainty, and the Alpha generated enormous uncertainty. One of the NATO's greatest concerns involved the Greenland Iceland United Kingdom gap, commonly known as the GI-UK gap. This region represents a critical choke point for Soviet submarines entering the Atlantic Ocean from northern bases. NATO surveillance system concentrated heavily on monitoring Soviet naval movement through these waters. The Alpha complicated these defense calculations. A high-speed Soviet submarine operating through the North Atlantic introduced possibilities NATO planners found deeply uncomfortable. Rapid interception of carrier groups, penetration of defensive screening systems, surprise attack against strategic naval assets, reduced interception time for NATO response forces. The psychological impact extended beyond naval warfare itself. During the Cold War, submarine fleets formed a critical part of nuclear deterrence strategy. Ballistic missile submarines represented survival second strike capability, the ability to retaliate after a nuclear attack. Any submarine capable of disrupting anti-submarine defense systems therefore threatened not just tactical operations but strategic nuclear stability itself. The Alpha was beginning to be viewed not merely as an advanced system but as a destabilizing strategic variable. At the same time, Western analysts continue struggling to reconcile the submarine's performance with Soviet industrial realities. This contradiction intensified anxiety further. If the Soviets could achieve such breakthroughs in submarine technology despite perceived industrial inefficiencies, what other assumptions could Soviet capability might also be wrong about? The question haunted many intelligence communities during the late Cold War. Because once a dominant power realizes its predictive model are flawed, paranoia expands rapidly. Every unknown becomes potentially dangerous. The Alpha's compact automated design contributed further to this atmosphere of unease. Smaller crew requirements implied reduced internal volume and potentially lower acoustic signature. The submarine's engineering philosophy increasingly appeared focused on concentrated operational lethality rather than balanced long-term efficiency. For years, American doctrine has assumed that Soviet engineering conservatism imposed natural limits on technological experimentation. The Alpha demonstrated that under certain conditions, the Soviet Union was fully willing to accept extreme engineering risk in exchange for temporary strategic asymmetry. That lesson mattered far beyond naval warfare, because it implied that Soviets could pursue disruptive technological leap in other military domains as well: military systems, aerospace engineering, anti satellite weapons, electronic warfare, undersea surveillance networks. The Alpha therefore became symbolic to something larger: the collapse of comfortable assumptions about predictable Soviet pattern. And once those assumptions collapsed, NATO commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. They were no longer fully certain they controlled the underwater balance of power.